Happy new moon. As I'm recording this, it's a new moon. And that means for the Dancing with the Goddess community, it's a new goddess that we're going to be talking about. And this month, we are going to talk about and connect with the Mesopotamian Goddess Inanna. She's also known as Ishtar. And this goddess is one of paradoxes, which makes her a really interesting and fun goddess to connect with. So I hope you join me in this episode as we talk about the paradoxes of the goddess Inanna. Welcome. Dancing with the Goddess is how we move through and experience life as modern mystic women. I believe anyone can be a modern mystic woman and experience awe, beauty, and magic in our daily lives. I'm Tora Arishnai Moon, goddess mystic, author, and creative. Join me as we discover who we are meant to be, explore different modalities for self-improvement and transformation, and reawaken to our goddess magic and feminine divine selves. I invite you to dance with the goddess with me. Here's today's episode. The goddess Inanna comes to us from the Mesopotamia area. And this is what is modern-day Iran, Iraq, Syria, that upper Middle East area, the cradle of civilization. And we'll talk about some of that with Inanna because she was the goddess responsible for giving humans civilization. So it's no wonder that we consider in the West Mesopotamia to be the cradle of civilization. She's known by two different names. Inanna is her Sumerian name, and Ishtar is her Akkadian name. Inanna, Ishtar are both the same. It's just a different way of pronouncing it based on if you're speaking Sumerian or Akkadian. The Sumerian era and time period, we also know that as Babylon. She was a major deity in the Sumerian and Babylonian myths. She was one of the 7 main deities. So she's a very important deity and one that has influenced many other cultures and their pantheons. She was known as the Queen of Heaven, as many goddesses are, and she was associated with the dawn star and with Venus. One of her symbols was the 8-pointed star. You also see those same associations with the Roman Venus and the Greek Aphrodite, which those two are similar goddesses. And they pull in a lot of influence from Inanna and Ishtar. Even as the ancient Mesopotamian civilizations were fading and some of these other Western civilizations of the Roman and the Greek were rising, Inanna, true to her nature, remained intact through becoming Venus and Aphrodite. And of course, Venus and Aphrodite have their own personalities and their own aspects as well. Some connect Inanna Ishtar with the Canaanite goddess Astarte. She's different. I personally don't connect Inanna with Astarte. They have two different mythologies and they come from different cultures. The Canaanites, we now know, the Canaanites gave rise to the Hebrews. So Astarte is more of that branch of Semitism. We have to remember when we're hearing all this talk today about anti-Semitism, Semitites weren't just Israelis or Hebrews or Jews. Semite is everyone from the ancient Mesopotamia area, which includes those people that white supremacy doesn't want to include. Iraqis, people from Iran, Palestinians, Middle Easterners are all Semites. So there's my little political insight there. Now, I haven't planned on talking about that, but before I do these episodes where I'm connecting and talking about the goddess, I do sit in meditation with the goddess, and I ask her to guide and inspire me. And I know she's here. Inanna is here. She's with me. And one of my gifts is to channel and speak for the goddess. So she may show up with a message for us today. I don't know. It's not me doing it. So if she chooses, we welcome her. If she chooses not to, we accept that as well. Remember, Inanna is the goddess of paradoxes. Some of the ways that we see Inanna as this goddess of paradox, she is connected with things that generally seem like they're polar opposites. And this polarity of hers helps us in connecting with and learning about duality and finding that unity in duality. Even those things that seem to be polar opposites have a place where they balance, where they unify. And that's one of the greatest lessons that Inanna can teach us, is through her polarities, through her paradoxes, of us learning how to find that place of unity in duality. So obviously one of Inanna's qualities is duality. And how do we find that balance within that duality? Inanna, or Ishtar, is the goddess of love and war. Those are usually two opposites. But Inanna, in her love, it is sex and physical love. It is not marriage love. It is not the love of a mother or the love of a wife. This is the love of life, the love of pleasure, of knowing who you are and what you want. And with that, she was also the goddess of war, of going out and conquering and getting what you want. It's not enough for Inanna to say, I want this. She goes out and takes it. Sometimes, quite frequently, not considering the consequences. That is an aspect of war, especially as patriarchy has embraced war. War has defined patriarchy. War is the way that patriarchy controls and conquers and overpowers others, whether that's a person, especially women, or people of color, or whoever they see as lesser than themselves. It's also through countries, how one country overpowers and dominates and conquers another country. When a country goes to war, they're saying, we are the supreme force. We know what's better for you than you know for yourself. That is absolute patriarchy. In some of the first writings we have about her, she wasn't connected so much with war. It was as patriarchy started to rise that she was attached to war and the victory of war. War was not one of the original acts of civilization that she brought to the people. It's a later construct. Another one of her paradoxes is that she is impulsive and calculating. She does what she wants, manipulates others to do what she wants or to make it happen without considering the consequences. It's what she wants, and so she goes after it. At the same time, she's very calculating about what she wants and how she's going to do it. If she can't get or do what she wants by herself, she convinces others to help her. She's very calculating in that way of, if I can't do it, how can I make it happen? How can I bring this about? In that way, if you follow human design, that's what a manifester does, is they want something, they figure out how it's going to get done. They initiate it, which is not a bad thing in and of itself. Where Inanna gets in trouble frequently is not considering the consequences. She's kind and caring, at the same time disregards other people's feelings and property. Some scholars have shown that she doesn't care for others because she throws Dumuzi, her lover, or Tammuz. Dumuzi is the Sumerian, Tammuz is the Akkadian. She sends him to take her place in the underworld, and that is seen as uncaring. When we talk about her myth of descending into the underworld in the next episode, we'll see that that wasn't really all there was to that. At the same time, she was very caring. She rewarded loyalty. She rewarded her servants and her priestesses that were loyal to her. For her, loyalty means a lot. In some cases, it was the difference between taking her place in the underworld or staying alive. That's how much she values loyalty. That is one of her qualities, is loyalty. She may be a bit capricious and impulsive. At the same time, she's extremely loyal and takes care of the people who are loyal to her. And it was an active temple. One of the reasons that we know a lot about Inanna and the Mesopotamian culture is it's one of the first Western places where we have writing, where writing was developed. In fact, writing was one of the gifts of civilization that Inanna brought to humanity. And the Sumerians figured out a writing system that we now call cuneiform. And it was lines and wedges chiseled into wet clay. When the clay hardened, it lasted a long time. So we still have these clay cylinders of cuneiform. We also have clay tablets with this cuneiform writing on it. One of the oldest stories that we have in Western civilization, and I'm pointing out it's Western civilization because the scholars were Victorian scholars and said, oh, this is the first writing ever in the world, discounting the Asian writing, which came about, I believe, I may not be totally correct on this, but I believe the Vedas in Hindu and in India were written right around that 3500 BCE, which is the same period that the Epic of Gilgamesh and the stories and hymns about Inanna were being written. In Western civilization, the Sumerians were the first with writing. Inanna had both priests and priestesses dedicated to serving her in her temples. One of her priestesses that we know from both historical, archaeological, and literature sources. So we know for a fact that this woman existed. Enheduanna, her priestess, lived between 2285 and 2250 BCE. She's the first known writer of story that we know. She wrote many, many hymns and poems about her patroness, the goddess Inanna or Ishtar. A number of these have survived to this day, which is why we know so much about Inanna and her worship and about the Mesopotamian culture. One of the oldest stories that we have is the Epic of Gilgamesh. And this epic, Inanna plays a central figure, which makes sense since she was a major deity of the time. What's interesting about this Epic of Gilgamesh is this story of Gilgamesh and his journey is one of the foundations for the hero's journey, which we talked a bit about in episode 17. Her journey and the story about Inanna gives us the foundations for the heroine's journey, which we also talked about in episode 17. So in this one story, we see that juxtaposition of the male perspective with the feminine perspective and how we do things differently. One of the stories and myths about Inanna that survived through Enheduanna's writing was the myth of how Inanna obtained the gifts of civilization that she brought to humanity. And in this myth, her father Enki was the leader of the gods, the father of the gods. Some of the stories about Enki influence the stories about the Hebrew god Yahweh and how he came to transform from a simple storm god into the major deity that we see today. It's through taking on attributes of Enki. Mesopotamian stories predate the Hebrew stories. Enki, as most men, he had these gifts of civilization. He knew they would help humanity. But as a man, And patriarchy, holding the knowledge and having that knowledge and withholding that knowledge, is power. That's that top of the pyramid. So he was not about to give this knowledge and this power to humanity. They could challenge the gods with this knowledge. He would lose his power over humanity if he let go of and shared this knowledge. This is one of those defining principles of patriarchy, is this withholding of knowledge, that knowledge is power. We've heard that. And in this knowledge is power, when you withhold this knowledge, you have power over the people who don't. Now, Inanna, in this paradox of not caring and caring, she cared about her followers. She cared about humanity. So she went to Enki, and being the calculating goddess she is, she knew she couldn't just ask him, "Hey, Dad, can I have these gifts of civilization so I can give them to humanity?" We know how that would go over. Not well at all. So instead, she went to her father Enki and got him rip-roariously drunk. And while he was drunk and not in full control of his capacities, she was like, "Hey, Dad, where's that tablet? I would love to see the tablet that contains the gifts of civilization." And of course, he's like showing it off and like, "Oh yes, look how wonderful and great this is." And he falls into a drunken stupor, and she takes the tablet and returns to Earth. By the time Enki wakes up and realizes what has happened, Inanna has shared that knowledge with humanity. Even if Enki regains possession of the tablet, the knowledge contained in that tablet has been disseminated. People know how to write. They know how to govern. They know how to do agriculture more efficiently. They know how to form cities and all these other things of civilization, looming and weaving fiber into textiles. Everything that we consider civilization was on this tablet, and Inanna shared. In that sharing of this knowledge is the matriarchal or the feminine divine way of leading. We lead in a circle, in a web. Yes, knowledge is power, but power is best found through disseminating and sharing that knowledge. The more people who have that knowledge, the more power there is for everyone. Women and the matriarchy and the feminine divine lead through community, through sharing. That includes knowledge and power. We don't want, nor do we lead from dominating and control over other people. We lead through community, through sharing, through empowerment. That's the difference between power and empowerment, and why so many women talk about empowering each other. It's not power over and controlling each other. It's finding our power within, empowerment. power from within. And our empowerment supports and encourages other women to find their own power. Whereas in patriarchy, you don't want people to find their own power because that challenges your power. Because if people have their own power, they know who they are and are comfortable and secure in that and are supporting each other, then you can't control them. You can't dominate them. And in patriarchy, you've lost your power that way. Whereas in matriarchy and the feminine divine way, the more people who have power and who are empowered and who know who they are and their strengths, the more powerful the entire community is. When you read about the worship of Inanna, you find this term called sacred prostitutes. When we hear that term, we have to remember that the scholars who were first translating these cuneiform tablets and writing of ancient Sumerian were Victorian men. They weren't women, they were Victorian men who were fully steeped in patriarchal views and perceptions and perspectives, which meant anything connected with sex outside of church-condoned marriage was immoral and wrong. However, we have to consider the culture and the beliefs of the time that these writings were being done. When you have a culture where one of the major deities like Inanna, who have priestesses and priests, and one of the first writings about transgenders as serving Inanna through sex. Their sacred duty was to connect humans, the mundane world, through this sacred act, the sacred spiritual act of sex. That when a person came to the temple, whether they were male or female, no matter what their sexual orientation, there was a priest or priestess or a they priestess or a they priest that could help them connect with the divine, with Inanna, through this sacred act of sex. The priests and priestesses serving Inanna became an embodiment of Inanna. So when the person off the street came into the temple and had sex with this priest or priestess, they were worshiping Inanna. It was not sex for gratification's sake. Of course, there was pleasure. Inanna's all about pleasure. But it was also this sacredness there. And when these Victorian men read these stories and these incidences of sex within a temple, of course they put the term prostitute on it, just as they did when they looked at Mary Magdalene and called her a prostitute. Because sex outside of what they, the Victorian men, considered moral. It was from a patriarchy point of view, because that type of sex, and only a marriage, mostly applied to women, was a way to control and overpower and dominate women. When women can have pleasure and joy through sex, it empowers us. One of the problems that the patriarchy is facing right now in today's world is because women found a reliable contraceptive so that women could choose when they wanted to have children or if they wanted to have children. That allowed us to go to college, become professionals, to work outside of the home, to not be dependent upon and have all of our labor at the beck and call of men. Men could no longer control us. So now what we're seeing in the United States is this attempt to control women again through childbearing, through taking away one of the most basic rights that any human has, and that is choosing what happens to our own body. Having bodily autonomy empowers us. And the patriarchy doesn't like that. Whether that's with women or people of color. When the white supremacist in the United States was practicing slavery removes that basic bodily autonomy right. As a slave, you don't have any say whatsoever about what happens to your body. We see this through the purposeful breeding of slaves, that they couldn't choose where to live, what to do, and not discounting at all the experience of people of color, and not even equating their experience. But the same tactics of slavery have been applied to women for thousands of years since the rise of patriarchy. This denying of our bodily autonomy, this talking about we are lesser than because we're not as intelligent, that was applied to women as well as people of color. I fully acknowledge, as a white woman in American society, that I have experienced white privilege. However, that does not discount the experiences that I've had of white supremacy and patriarchy and misogyny that has occurred in my life. The lesson of Inanna and this sexual freedom that was freely worshipped and practiced within her temples. Remember, it wasn't just one temple. It wasn't just at her main temple in Uruk. It was in all of her temples, which was scattered throughout the entire land. So this was a common practice. Looking at this, we can reconnect to our empowerment, because at that time, women experienced bodily autonomy too. Otherwise, this practice would not have existed. It would only have been men who went to the temples to worship Inanna through this sacred sexual act. It wouldn't have been women going. It wouldn't have been gay and queer people going. We also know that Inanna's priesthood included non-gendered people as well. In Inanna's temple and in her priesthood, there were men transgenders who called themselves Kurgara. They saw themselves as female, and so they castrated themselves. Females who identified as males were known as Galatur, and both of these were thought to be neither male nor female. They were transgendered. And part of this transgendered and this neither male nor female comes through the story of the descent of Inanna and in honoring of that. And in part of her descent is the way she was revived and resurrected was through Enki sending down two beings that were neither male nor female, so therefore they could leave the underworld. And they carried with them the water and food of life that they gave Inanna. So Inanna's priesthood included this third gender of transgendered people who served her. They weren't hidden in the back. They were also part of this serving through sacred sexual rites. We know Inanna's temples were incredibly wealthy and prosperous. So it wasn't like just a few people were attending and worshiping at Inanna's temples. We know that they were abundant and very prosperous because one of the very, very, very first writings that have been found is accounting records. They were the records maintained by the priestesses, accounting for the tithes and offerings given to the temple for Inanna. Along with this idea of sex being a sacred rite, in order for kings at the time to become the king and to be coronated, to have that right of sovereignty conferred upon them, they performed what was known as the sacred marriage. It's unclear whether that was a actual sexual act, actual copulation with Inanna's high priestess, or just a symbolic one. However, one of the rites that the kings had to go through before they were considered the king was they had to spend the night with Inanna's high priestess. And in that capacity as her high priestess, the priestess embodied and became Inanna. It was through Inanna and the feminine divine that the king was given the right to rule over the people, assuming in that he would rule for the best of the community. Of course, that didn't always happen, but that's where it started, was that the king ruled to maintain what was best for the community. And then as patriarchy rose, it became the king did what was best for the king. We see that today, that the government does what's best for the ruling power and forgets what's best for the community, which was why we need to have this major shift in government, that we move away from patriarchy more into a matriarchy and into the feminine divine. And in this feminine divine perspective, it is not women over men, it is the balance between them, this equity between men and women. Everything that I do is geared towards women, for women, to help women awaken, attune, and embody their feminine divine, because finding this place of equity and balance does not mean we push men down. It means we raise women up. And that's where we find this equity. That's where we find the unity in duality. When we have a duality that is in imbalance, not balanced, like what we're seeing today and what we've experienced with patriarchy for the last 2,000 to 3,000 years, in order to get that unity in duality, we've got to raise women. We have to raise people of color, or what we call the minorities, which really isn't. It's the global majority, but the white supremacy has been supreme for an extremely long time. So we have to raise all of that up in order to end the racism, all the isms, the genderisms, the sexism, the ageism even. Working with and connecting with Inanna or Ishtar, we can find that unity in duality. Looking at her paradoxes, we can find where they come into balance. Inanna and that feminine perspective of leadership can show us how we can empower ourselves. We can regain as women and people of color. We can regain that power that comes from bodily autonomy, of sharing knowledge and power. If you know something, don't be in the patriarchy mindset and hoard that knowledge. Be more in the feminine divine mindset of sharing that knowledge. It is through our sharing of our knowledge that we empower each other and ourselves, and we create more of a community. We move away from this patriarchal point of view of isolation as a nuclear family and return to living as a community. And I invite you to embrace worshiping Inanna through the sacred sexual act, and remembering that doing this with your partner is a form of worship, that it's sacred, that you cannot honor and worship the divine that is in your partner, that your partner reflects, just as you reflect it within you. If there's an element of hate, of control, of power over, of hurting the other person through the sacred sexual act, there's the paradox there. There's Inanna's paradox. Sex is sacred, and it can be used in an abusive way. Let's move more toward the sacredness again. Let's remember the sacredness of sharing our bodies, of connecting to the divine through our bodies. And I talked a bit about that sacredness of our bodies in episode 12 and 13, in both our body image and being self-full. That sacredness of our bodies includes whom we share our bodies with and how we share them. And that is our choice. As a divine, feminine woman, it is your choice whom you have sex with and whether or not you have children and when you have children. Inanna is never, ever shown as a mother or a wife. And yet, she is extremely powerful. Find your own power within. Remember who you are. Find your balance. Find your joy. Discover what is right for you. That is how you become an empowered, awakened, attuned, feminine, divine woman. And with that message from Inanna, we are complete. May you dance with Inanna and remember who you are and the power and the strength that resides within you. Thanks for watching. I hope you enjoyed this episode and it deepened your dance with the goddess. Please subscribe to our channel, like and share the video, and feel free to comment. This helps more women find our show. To support the show, please donate to buymeacoffee.com DWGpod. Your donations help support the cost of hosting, editing, and production of the podcast. We appreciate your support. May the rest of your day be amazing, and may you dance with the goddess in love and joy.